The Price of Kindness. Part I, Facing the Circle. Thomas Hayes woke to silence, not the peaceful kind that wrapped around his remote cabin most mornings, but the weighted silence that precedes something breaking. His weathered hand instinctively reached for the Winchester 73, leaning against his bedpost, a habit formed during the war between the states and sharpened by 3 years alone on the Arizona frontier. The floor creaked beneath his bare feet as he moved to the window, parting the gingham curtain his wife had sewn before consumption took her. What he saw froze his blood colder than the February air. 300 Navajo warriors on horseback stood in perfect formation around his cabin, their bodies dark silhouettes against the pale dirt of the valley, not moving, not attacking, just watching. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, counting rifles, calculating odds with the precision of a man who'd survived Gettysburg. 30 rounds for the Winchester, 12 for the Colt, against 300. No man faced those odds and lived to tell the tale. 3 days earlier, Thomas had buried his last chicken, victim to a red fox that had torn through the coop with ruthless efficiency. As he'd stood over the small grave, the enormity of his solitude had pressed down on him like the weight of the mountains themselves. At 60, with joints that predicted rain and memories that prevented sleep, the ranch his Catherine had loved felt increasingly impossible to maintain. Arizona Territory, 1,885. A hard land that made hard men and broke those who couldn't bend. The treaty with the Navajo had collapsed last autumn when silver was discovered on reservation land. Raids and counter-raids had been escalating ever since. Just last week, the Prescott newspaper reported 3 homesteads burned 30 miles east. Sheriff Jackson had ridden out the previous afternoon, dust trailing behind his Appaloosa mare like a warning. "Tom," he'd said, leaning against the porch rail and turning his Stetson in calloused hands, "you're too isolated out here. Jenkins' family was hit 2 nights ago. Mother and children taken." Thomas had poured 2 fingers of whiskey into 10 cups, the bottle already half empty. "Navajo? That's the story," Jackson replied, his peacemaker holstered but always within reach. At 55, Jackson had been a lawman since Arizona was still Mexican territory. The silver at his temples matched the inlay on his pistol grip, both earned through years of standing between civilization and chaos. "You should come into town until the army gets this under control. No shame in it." Thomas had looked across the land that had taken everything from him and somehow still held him fast. "I stood at Seminary Ridge with Pickett's men. Will. Watched half my company die before we even reached the wall. If the Rebs couldn't run me off, I'm damned if I'll let a few Indians do it." Jackson had given him the look reserved for stubborn fools and dead men walking. War makes men think they're immortal if they survived once. It's a dangerous delusion, Tom. After Jackson left, Thomas had reinforced his shutters, cleaned his firearms, and placed buckets of water strategically throughout the cabin. A man prepared rarely had to fight, his father had taught him. A man unprepared rarely survived to fight again. That evening, as sunset painted the valley in fierce oranges and reds, Thomas heard them, voices, low and careful, speaking a language he didn't understand. He'd grabbed the Winchester, loaded and ready, and stepped onto his porch. 15 Navajo men emerged from the tree line, their bodies thin as shadows, clothes torn, and faces gaunt with hunger. The leader, an older man with silver-streaked hair and a face mapped with lines of hardship, held his hands open and empty. Thomas kept the rifle lowered but ready. He'd killed men in the war, but never with eagerness, and never without cause. These men carried no visible weapons. Their eyes held exhaustion, not aggression. And their bodies told a story he recognized: the hollow cheeks, the way they swayed slightly when standing still. These men were starving. In the silence between them, Thomas made a decision that would reshape the valley and every life in it. He lowered the Winchester completely, stepped back, and gestured them inside. "Come on then," he said, though they couldn't understand his words. "Before you fall over." They ate everything. He had cornbread, salt, pork, his winter preserves, even the coffee beans, ground and boiled to bitter strength. They ate in silence, their eyes downcast, their hands deliberate and careful with his china plates, another remnant of Catherine's civilizing influence. When they finished, the older man stood. His eyes met Thomas's directly for the first time, obsidian, dark and measuring. He placed something on the table between them, a carved wooden bird, wings extended in flight, crafted with such precision that Thomas half expected it to take wing. The workmanship surpassed anything he'd seen from white craftsmen in town. The man touched his chest. "Ashki," he said, his voice rough as stone. Thomas nodded, understanding this was a name. He mirrored the gesture. "Thomas?" Ashki nodded once, gathered his people, and they disappeared into the darkness as silently as they'd arrived. Thomas stood alone in his kitchen, the wooden bird in his palm, wondering what exactly had just happened. Something significant had transpired. He felt it in his bones, the same way he'd felt the shift in air pressure before Pickett gave the order to advance at Gettysburg. He slept that night with the Winchester closer than usual, the carved bird on his bedside table, its wings seeming to move in the flickering lamplight. When he finally slept, he dreamed of Catherine, her face clearer than it had been in his dreams for months. She smiled at him, proud. Dawn brought the warriors. Part 2. Challenge and Choice. Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sun climb above the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor. 300 warriors remained motionless, their faces impassive, weapons visible but not aimed. He wore his old cavalry pistol on his hip and kept the Winchester in hand, not raised but ready. His breath came shallow and quick, but his hands remained steady. 23 years since Gettysburg, and his body still remembered how to prepare for death. "If you're coming for a fight," he called out, his voice carrying across the still morning air, "you'd best get to it. I've got coffee on the stove that'll burn if you dawdle." No response, no movement, just that patient, expectant stillness. An hour later, dust rose on the horizon, 6 riders approaching fast from the direction of town. Thomas recognized Jackson's blue shirt and the glint of his sheriff's badge. The men with him carried rifles across their saddles. "Thomas," Jackson called as they drew closer. "Get down, we'll cover you." "Hold your fire," Thomas shouted back, raising his hand. "They haven't made a move against me." Jackson and his men reined in 20 yards from the porch, their horses snorting and stamping. The men's faces were tight with alarm, fingers hovering near triggers. "What in God's name happened?" Jackson demanded, his eyes never leaving the wall of warriors surrounding the cabin. The Robertson boys spotted them moving before dawn. Whole damn town's in an uproar. Thomas explained the previous night's encounter as simply as he could. With each word, Jackson's expression shifted from concern to disbelief to something approaching anger. "You fed them," he stated flatly, "and now they've brought an army to your door." Thomas shook his head. "If they wanted me dead, Will, I'd be dead already. Been standing here since sunrise. They're waiting for something." Before Jackson could respond, more riders appeared, a dozen men from town, led by Marcus Reed, owner of the general store and self-appointed head of the newly formed Citizens Safety Committee. His shotgun rested prominently across his saddle. "Sheriff," Reed called out, "you were supposed to wait for us." "Situation called for immediate action," Jackson replied tersely. "Stand down, Marcus. No one's shooting yet." Reed's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. 300 savages surrounding a white man's home, and you're telling us to stand down? This is exactly why we formed the committee. As tensions mounted, a voice spoke from the back of Jackson's group. "I can talk to them." Heads turned to Solomon Washington, the town's blacksmith. A former Buffalo soldier who'd fought Apaches before settling in the territory, Solomon was respected for his skill with metal but rarely included in town decisions. "You speak their language?" Thomas asked. Solomon shook his head. "Not fluently. Learned enough to trade and track when I was with the 10th Cavalry. Might be enough." Reed scoffed. "We don't negotiate with raiders." "Better than shooting blind," Jackson countered. "Solomon, you willing to risk it?" The blacksmith nodded. Seems to me Mr. Hayes here already took the biggest risk, inviting them in last night. Least I can do is try to understand why they came back. Thomas and Solomon approached the warriors slowly, hands visible, weapons holstered or left behind. As they drew closer, a single rider broke from the formation. Thomas recognized Ashkey immediately. The older Navajo dismounted 15 feet away. His clothing was different today, adorned with symbols Thomas didn't recognize, his bearing more formal. Solomon spoke hesitantly in the Navajo tongue, his pronunciation causing Ashkey to tilt his head slightly before responding. Their exchange continued for several minutes, Solomon clearly struggling to follow parts of it. Finally, he turned to Thomas. He says they've brought payment for your kindness. Before Thomas could ask what that meant, Ashkey gestured, and 4 warriors rode forward, leading pack horses laden with goods, dried meat, corn, beans, tanned hides, even woven blankets brilliant with color. That's half the reservation's winter stores, Solomon murmured, visibly shocked. Ashkey spoke again, at length. Solomon listened intently, asking for clarification several times. The men you fed, he translated finally, were his son, brothers, and nephews, the family of their chief. They'd been separated from their hunting party in a storm, 4 days without food. Thomas remembered their hollow faces, the careful way they'd eaten, as if afraid each bite might be their last. He says the other settlers turned them away, fired shots over their heads, but you shared your last food. Solomon paused. He says there's an ancient law among their people. When someone saves your family from death, they become family too, protected always. The weight of those words settled over Thomas like a physical thing. Solomon continued, they've come to declare you under their protection. Every warrior here is family to the men you fed, cousins, brothers, sons. They're showing you that you're not alone anymore. Thomas looked past Ashkey to the hundreds of warriors beyond. Ask him how long they plan to stay. After another exchange, Solomon said, they won't camp in the valley. They'll return to their lands. But they'll come regularly to check on you, bring supplies when needed. He hesitated. And if anyone harms you, they'll come back to make it right. From behind them, Reed's voice carried clearly. That sounds like a threat. Thomas turned to see that Reed and several others had moved closer, listening. Sounds like family to me, Thomas replied. No different than you boys watching out for each other in town. Reed's face flushed. It's not the same, and you know it. They're claiming authority over white settlements. Solomon translated Reed's concerns. Ashkey's response was immediate and forceful. He says they make no claim to your land, Solomon translated. The land remains yours, but Thomas is now also theirs. This is their way. The standoff continued, tension building as more settlers arrived, drawn by rumors spreading like wildfire. By noon, nearly 40 armed men stood on one side of the clearing, with 300 warriors on the other, and Thomas and Solomon caught between worlds. From the settlers' side, voices grew louder, demanding the Navajo leave, questioning Thomas's loyalty, suggesting the army be summoned from Fort Whipple. In that moment of escalation, when a single nervous trigger finger might have ignited a bloodbath, Ashkey reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew another carved bird, identical to the first. He placed it carefully in Thomas's palm, then spoke. One for the meal that saved, Solomon translated. One for the lives you honored. Thomas looked down at the wooden bird, then at the divide between the two groups, a divide he now straddled by circumstance and choice. The carved wings seemed to beat against his palm, urging flight or fight. Every man must choose his ground. Catherine had told him that once, as he prepared to return to war. Choose where you stand, and stand there. Part 3. Resolution. Thomas Hayes had faced death at Gettysburg, watched good men fall at Antietam, and buried the only woman he'd ever loved on a windswept hill behind his cabin. But he'd never faced a choice quite like this, caught between two worlds ready to destroy each other. With his decision, the only thing holding back the flood. Tell them, Thomas said quietly to Solomon, that I accept their protection and their friendship. Solomon's eyes widened slightly. You sure about this? Won't sit well with folks in town. "I've made harder choices," Thomas replied, thinking of the blood-soaked fields of Pennsylvania. Translated. As Solomon spoke, Thomas turned to face the settlers, his neighbors, and in better times his friends. "These men aren't here for war," he called out, projecting his voice as he once had across battlefields. "If they were, we'd already be dead. They've come with gifts, not threats." Reed stepped forward, shotgun gripped tight. "They've come to claim you as theirs. By your own admission, today it's one man, tomorrow it's the whole valley." "They claim me as family," Thomas corrected, "because I treated them like men instead of enemies." Jackson moved to stand beside Thomas, his hand conspicuously away from his holster. "Tom's right. They could have attacked at dawn. Could have killed him last night when he was alone. They didn't. So we just let them dictate terms?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Let them claim one of our own?" Thomas felt something shift inside him, a certainty he hadn't felt since the war. He walked forward until he stood directly between the two groups, then set his Winchester on the ground. Unarmed, he turned to face his neighbors. "I buried my Catherine on that hill 3 years ago," he said, pointing to the rise behind his cabin. "Since then, I've had no family. No one who'd miss me if I was gone." His voice remained steady. "These people have offered me something none of you ever did, a place to belong." A murmur ran through the settlers. "I'm not choosing them over you," Thomas continued. "I'm choosing peace over war. I watched half my company die charging a wall we had no business charging, following orders that made no sense. I won't watch good men die here today over fear and pride." Jackson stepped forward. "Tom's right. We've got no cause to fight today." "No cause?" Reed's voice cracked with disbelief. "There are 300 armed Indians surrounding a white settlement." "There are 300 men honoring a debt," Thomas corrected. "And I'd rather have them as friends than enemies." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, Ashkee turned to his warriors and spoke a command. As one, they dismounted and sat upon the ground, weapons laid aside. The gesture was unmistakable. They had made themselves vulnerable, a sign of peaceful intent so clear that even the most fearful settler could understand it. One by one, rifles lowered among the white men, not holstered, not set aside, but no longer aimed to kill. It was a beginning. Thomas walked to Ashkee and extended his hand in the white man's gesture of peace. After a moment's consideration, the Navajo leader clasped it firmly. "Tell him," Thomas said to Solomon, "that I'll do my best to be worthy of the honor they've shown me." As Solomon translated, Ashkee smiled for the first time, a brief flash of humanity across his solemn features. He reached into his pouch once more and produced a third carved bird, pressing it into Thomas's palm alongside the others. "3 birds," Solomon translated. "One for the meal shared, one for the lives saved, one for the bridge built between worlds." By sundown, an uneasy truce held. The warriors departed in formation, riding north toward their lands. Most of the settlers returned to town, leaving Jackson and a few others to sit with Thomas on his porch as darkness fell. "You've changed things," Jackson said finally, nursing a cup of coffee laced with whiskey. "For better or worse, this valley won't be the same." Thomas nodded, turning one of the wooden birds in his hand, watching how its wings caught the lamplight. "Change comes whether we will it or not. Better to shape it than be broken by it." "Some folks won't forgive you," Jackson warned. "Reed's already calling you Indian lover in town." "I've been called worse," Thomas replied, "usually by better men." The winter passed more easily than Thomas had expected. True to their word, Navajo riders appeared every fortnight, bringing supplies and brief, respectful visits. Solomon often rode out to translate, gradually teaching Thomas basic phrases in the Navajo tongue. In town, reactions remained mixed. Some avoided Thomas entirely. Others, remembering his service during the war, extended cautious acceptance. The minister's wife made a point of bringing him preserves after Sunday services, a small gesture that spoke volumes. When spring brought new grass to the valley, it also brought trouble. Raiders, not Navajo, but white men taking advantage of the tensions attacked the Peterson homestead 10 miles east. 2 family members were killed, their livestock stolen. Before the sheriff could organize a posse, Navajo scouts appeared at Thomas's door with news. The raiders were hiding in Box Canyon, they reported through Solomon. They offered to help recover what was stolen and bring the criminals to justice. Jackson, skeptical but pragmatic, accepted their aid. The combined force of settlers and warriors tracked the raiders to their camp and surrounded them at dawn. The fight was brief and decisive. 2 raiders died resisting. The others surrendered when they realized they were outnumbered. When they returned to town with the captured men and recovered livestock, something fundamental had changed. The settlers had seen the Navajo fight alongside them, not against them. They'd witnessed the trackers' skill, the warriors' discipline, and most importantly, their honor and victory. That summer, Thomas planted twice his usual crops, aided by Navajo hands. The suspicious stares from townfolk gradually gave way to curious questions. How did the Navajo grow corn in such dry soil? What were the medicinal uses of desert plants? What game signs had the white hunters missed? Knowledge began to flow cautiously at first, then more freely. By autumn, when Thomas hosted a harvest gathering at his cabin, settlers and Navajo shared food at the same tables. Chief Ashkey himself attended, presenting Thomas with a ceremonial blanket before all assembled a formal recognition of their bond. As winter approached once more, Thomas sat on his porch, watching the valley transform in the fading light. His cabin was no longer isolated, but had become a crossing point between worlds. The loneliness that had threatened to consume him after Catherine's death had been replaced by purpose. Inside, the 3 carved birds hung above his fireplace, their wooden wings forever frozen in flight, yet somehow still soaring. Sheriff Jackson, now a frequent visitor, settled into the adjacent chair with a groan. "You know what Peterson said to me yesterday? Asked if I thought the Navajo would teach his boy tracking come spring." He shook his head in amazement. 6 months ago, he was calling for the Army to remove them all to reservations in Oklahoma. "Fear makes simple men cruel," Thomas replied, "and cruelty makes them blind. Break that cycle, and people can begin to see clearly again." "Philosopher now, are you?" Jackson chuckled, but his eyes remained serious. "You changed the course of a river that day, Tom. Diverted a flood that would have drowned us all." Thomas shook his head. "I just fed some hungry men. The rest happened on its own." "Nothing happens on its own," Jackson countered. "Men choose for good or ill. You chose when it mattered." As darkness settled over the valley, Thomas thought about choice and consequence, about wooden birds and bridges between worlds, about how a simple act of kindness had transformed not just his life, but an entire community. In war, he'd learned to kill efficiently. In peace, he'd learned something far more powerful, how to build connections that no bullet could sever. The night was cold, the stars sharp as glass overhead. But Thomas Hayes sat warm on his porch, protected by something stronger than walls or weapons, a bond of honor forged in a moment of compassion and tempered in the fires of conflict survived together. 3 wooden birds, 1 meal, 15 hungry men, 300 warriors, 1,000 possibilities for the future. And for the first time in 3 years, the weight of solitude lifted from Thomas Hayes' shoulders like morning mist before the rising Sunday. The end.